Okay, just to recap on where we are here, we saw in chapter 10, Jesus was in Jerusalem at the time of the Feast of Dedication, which was around December time of our calendar. And again, he was in conversation and discussion with the Jews there in the temple. They had asked him, "If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." And Jesus went on to say that he had already told them, but they were not willing to believe what he had said. And he ended up by saying, making that claim to identify himself with the Father in verse 30, where he says, "I and the Father are one." Well, that set the Jews up then to attempt to stone Jesus. They took up stones again to stone him because they understood what Jesus was claiming when he said that. But they were unable to do that. In verse 39 says they tried to arrest him, but he escaped from their hands. And the chapter 10 concluded with Jesus leaving Jerusalem and going away across to the eastern side of the River Jordan. And we're told there that he went to the place where John at first baptized, and he remained there. And whilst he was there, there were many who came to him and believed in him. So it's quite a different reception that Jesus got there on the other side of the Jordan compared to the reception he had received, the hostile reception that he had received in Jerusalem. So we come into chapter 11 this evening, and this is the wonderful story of the resurrection of Lazarus. This is an incident which is only recorded by John in his gospel. None of the other gospels record this. And this is the final sign that John records. If you remember, John calls the miracles of Jesus signs, and there are 7 of them in the gospel, and this is the 7th and final sign that we have here. Each of the gospel writers selected their own material from. They would have had their own sources of material, and so we do find that particularly with John's gospel, there's a lot in John's gospel that isn't recorded in the other gospels. But the synoptics refer to the other 3 gospels as the synoptics because the sort of parallel, very similar material in each of them. But the synoptics record 2 other resurrection miracles that Jesus performed, neither of which are recorded by John. And those are the raising of Jairus's daughter, which Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all 3 of them record. And then also another story, the raising of the son of the widow of Nain, which is only found in Luke's gospel. There is also a general reference to Jesus raising the dead in Matthew chapter 11 and verse 5. In Jesus' own words here, this is after John the Baptist is in prison, and he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And Jesus' answer for them to take back is, "Go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight, and the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them." So in that list there of things that he's been doing, Jesus mentions that the dead are raised up. So we don't know exactly how many people there were who Jesus did raise from the dead. We do have these 3 stories recorded, though, these 3 individuals: the daughter of Jairus, the son of the widow of Nain, and here in John's gospel, Lazarus. The raising of Lazarus was a sign. As we mentioned, John refers to the miracles as signs. So it was a sign pointing to Jesus as the resurrection and the life. As we will see, that is a claim that Jesus makes in connection with this. And the miracle revealed him to be the Messiah, and it really only intensified the opposition to Jesus and the desire of the Jewish leaders to kill him. We see in chapter 11 and verse 53, after the miracle has occurred, the Jewish authorities held a consultation together, and verse 53 says, "So from that day on they took counsel how to put him to death." So plans were being made to try to put Jesus to death. So we come into the chapter itself then in chapter 11 here, and the first 4 verses of the chapter set the scene for us and introduce the main characters who are involved. So John chapter 11 verses 1 to 4 says this: Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness is not unto death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. Lazarus is introduced to us here as a certain man of Bethany. You can see on the map there the location of Bethany compared to Jerusalem, quite near to Jerusalem. And we're told that he is ill. Bethany was the village of the sisters Mary and Martha, so they are introduced to us here as well. And this here is the first mention of Lazarus that we have, although the same name Lazarus is used in the parable that Jesus told of the rich man and Lazarus, which is recorded by Luke in chapter 16. But there's no connection, it's just the names are the same. The sisters, though, Mary and Martha, are mentioned in Luke's Gospel as well, in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 to 42, where Jesus had gone to their home, and Martha was the one who was busy preparing to entertain Jesus, preparing a meal for him, and Mary was the one who was seated at his feet, listening to him teach. So the 2 sisters have been introduced there in Luke's Gospel as well. The village of Bethany, as mentioned, was close to Jerusalem. Further down in verse 18, we're told that Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. And this Bethany was where Jesus stayed often, particularly during the last week of his life. He would go into Jerusalem during the daytime and then retire to Bethany in the evening. This is different. This Bethany is different to a different place to Bethany beyond the Jordan, which is mentioned in John chapter 1, verse 28, as where John was baptizing. So that may have been where Jesus is at this time, he's in that other Bethany on the eastern side of the Jordan. So the two Bethanies are mentioned here by John in chapter 1, verse 28, and then here as well. The relationship between Lazarus, Mary, and Martha is that they are brother and sisters. And Mary here in verse 2 is identified as the one who anointed Jesus' feet with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, although John does not record this event until the next chapter, in chapter 12. At the beginning of chapter 12, we have that story, but he mentions it beforehand here, so it must have been a story that would have been familiar to his readers, perhaps from other sources as well. It's as if he's saying, well, you remember that Mary, the one who anointed Jesus with her ointment, well, it was her brother Lazarus who was ill. So Mary and Martha then sent this message to Jesus, informing him of Lazarus' illness. And in verse 3, they refer to Lazarus as he whom you love. The sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. There's no specific request made that Jesus should come. Perhaps they took it for granted that Jesus would come on learning of the illness of his friend, and the message may imply an appeal for help. But Jesus' response to the message is interesting. He says, this illness is not unto death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. Back in chapter 9, in the story of the blind man, the man who had been blind from birth, in verse 3 of chapter 9, Jesus said that the man's blindness was so that the works of God might be made manifest in him. On that occasion, the disciples were asking, well, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, well, neither of them sinned. It was so that the works of God might be made manifest in him. So here, in the case of Lazarus, a similar reason is given for the illness of Lazarus. Jesus says it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by means of it. When Jesus said here that this illness is not unto death, he did not mean that Lazarus would not die. Later, Jesus says Lazarus is dead. Lazarus does die. But rather, the end of the illness will not be death, but rather it will be for the glory of God. So this death will not be a permanent state. It's not a spiritual death. So death is not going to be the end of the matter. Death does not have the final say in this. Through this, then, Jesus says that God and the Son of God will be glorified. And in John's Gospel, Jesus is often said to be glorified through his death upon the cross. We'll see this in chapter 12, verse 16. This is after Jesus has made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem. His disciples did not understand this at first, but when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that this had been written of him, had been done to him. So when John says when Jesus was glorified, he's making reference to Jesus' death there. And then in verse 23 of chapter 12 as well, there's Jesus' own words here. This is when Philip and Andrew come to him, and there's some Greeks who want to see Jesus. And Jesus says, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. So now he speaks of him, the hour has come for him to be glorified, again referring to his death. So the raising of Lazarus here will be one more event which will take Jesus closer to the cross and closer to his own glorification. We'll read on now. Those first opening verses, the first 4 verses, set the scene for us, introduce us to Lazarus and to Mary and Martha. Now we read on in verses 5 to 16. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard that he was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, let us go into Judea again. The disciples said to him, Rabbi, the Jews were but now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again? Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him. Thus he spoke, and then he said to them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him out of sleep. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover. Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Jesus' love for Martha, for her sister Mary, and for Lazarus is noted there in verse 5. There are actually only 5 people Jesus is said to have loved. These 3, Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. The other 2 are the rich young ruler in Mark chapter 10, verse 21, where Mark tells us that Jesus, looking upon him, loved him. And then the 5th one is one of the disciples, known as the disciple whom Jesus loved, who is the writer of this gospel. In chapter 13 of John and verse 23, we're told there that one of his disciples whom Jesus loved was lying close to the breast of Jesus, and then other references to that one disciple whom Jesus loved, who we assume is John himself. So only 5 individuals of whom it is personally said that Jesus loved them. Of course, we know Jesus loves everyone, but these are the 5 named individuals. Now, if a close friend whom you love is ill, the natural desire would be to want to go to that friend as quickly as possible. But interestingly, here, Jesus did not go immediately. We're told in verse 6 that he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. John has already noted Jesus' love for this family, for Martha, Mary, and Lazarus, so it is not out of a lack of love or concern that Jesus delayed going. It would seem likely that Jesus did not hurry off immediately because he knew that Lazarus was already dead. Here in chapter 11 and verse 39, we're told that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days when Jesus arrived. This is when Jesus comes to the tomb eventually and instructs them to take the stone away. And Martha says, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Now, if it took the messengers 1 day, assume it would perhaps a day's journey to reach Jesus where he was on the other side of the Jordan with news of Lazarus' illness, then Jesus waited for 2 days, and then it would take him another day to reach Bethany. That would make 4 days, and that's the length of time that Lazarus has been dead. So most likely Lazarus would have been dead by the time the messengers arrived with news of his illness. But whatever the reason for this 2-day wait, Jesus is going to act in his own time. He will go to Lazarus at the moment that he chooses, when he knows it is the right time to go, and he won't go any sooner than that. So now, after these 2 days have passed, Jesus then proposes to his disciples that they should now go into Judea. He says, "Let us go into Judea again." But the disciples protest, and they warn Jesus of the danger that he will face if he does go back to Judea. "Rabbi," they address him, "the Jews were but now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?" We've seen earlier in chapter 8, verse 59, that there in Jerusalem they took up stones to throw at him, but Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple. And then again in chapter 10, verse 31, the Jews took up stones again to stone at him. So the disciples know the danger that Jesus would face if he were to return to Judea. There'd be a considerable risk for him. But Jesus' answer is somewhat enigmatic. In verses 9 and 10, he reminds them that during daylight hours, a man can walk without stumbling, he says, because he sees the light of this world. But to walk at night time without a light, a man will stumble. And these words are similar to those that Jesus spoke in chapter 9, verses 4 and 5, with the giving of sight to the man who was blind, where Jesus had said, "We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night comes when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." So in both cases, Jesus seems to be suggesting that he's only going to be there with them for a limited amount of time. So the idea is of whilst the light is with you, whilst it's light, whilst it's daylight, then take advantage of that, use that light. And Jesus, the light of the world, is not always going to be present with them, and therefore they need to do what they can whilst they have him with them. Time is something that is under Jesus' own control, and he's not always going to be there. Jesus then speaks of Lazarus's condition in verse 11. He says, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awake him out of sleep." Jesus refers to the state of death as it being a sleep here, and if it's a sleep, then it's not something that is to be feared. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 52, this was after Jesus' own resurrection. In Matthew chapter 27 verse 52, we are told of those tombs in Jerusalem that were opened, and we're told many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. So sleep is used to describe their condition there as well. And in Acts chapter 7 and verse 60, referring to the death of Stephen here, Stephen has just prayed, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And he knelt down and cried with a loud voice, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And when he had said this, he fell asleep. So again, Stephen's death described as falling asleep. Paul, in writing to the Thessalonians, also speaks of death as a sleep. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, he says, "But we would not have you ignorant, brethren, concerning those who are asleep, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep." So since Jesus' own death and resurrection, Christians can view death as a sleep. And the word cemetery, the origin of the word cemetery, means a place of sleep. But the disciples misunderstood what Jesus was saying here. They thought that Jesus was talking about natural sleep. And if Lazarus is asleep, then he will recover. So sleep would be a good sign that he's on the mend. But John explains the misunderstanding here. He says that Jesus had been speaking of death in verse 13. Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest in sleep. A similar confusion had occurred when Jesus went to the home of Jairus and when his daughter had died. In Luke chapter 8, verses 52 and 53, when Jesus goes to the home there. He arrives there, and there's all the people hanging around, weeping and wailing, and all were weeping and bewailing her. But he said, "Do not weep, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. So again, Jesus uses the term sleep to suggest that, well, this isn't a permanent condition. If you fall asleep, then you wake up, and the same with death as well. So Jesus now speaks to the disciples plainly in order to remove their confusion. In verse 14, he says, "Lazarus is dead." Jesus had only been informed of Lazarus's illness, but Jesus knows that Lazarus is dead. And he continues and says, "And for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe." So in some way, the events that are to follow will build up the faith of the disciples, that if Jesus had been there, then their faith would not have the same opportunity to grow and develop as it would have now that Lazarus is dead. And so Jesus then exhorts his disciples to come with him. He says, "But let us go to him." The words of Jesus have still not really been understood by the disciples, and Thomas, called the twin, and this is the first reference we have to Thomas in John's Gospel. Thomas spoke up to the other disciples, saying, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Thomas is expecting death, and he encourages the other disciples to go along as well. Where the way that Thomas is thinking is, well, if Lazarus is dead, and if we're going to Lazarus, then that must mean that we're going to die. So, okay, let's go with Jesus and die with him too. So although he's misunderstanding Jesus here, Thomas' words are perhaps an expression of his loyalty to Jesus, that he is prepared to follow Jesus even to death itself. Well, the story develops further here. We'll read verses 17 to 27 now. Now, when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary sat in the house. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha said to him, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this?" She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world." So Jesus now arrives in Bethany, making that journey, and he is first met by Martha. And on arriving in Bethany, he's informed that Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. In Palestine, the burial would take place very soon after death. The heat of the climate would make that necessary, that the body should be very soon buried after death had occurred. The 4 days that Lazarus has been in the tomb would emphasize the hopelessness of his condition, that he really is dead, and it would take an act of God to bring him back. John then gives that little bit of geographical information about the location of Bethany in verse 18, telling us that it was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off. The Greek is literally 15 stadia, and a stadia was a Roman measurement. So in our measurements, it would be roughly 2 miles. And the close proximity of Bethany to Jerusalem explains why so many of the Jews were able to be with Martha and Mary to console them. When news of Jesus' arrival came to Martha, we're told that she went out to meet him whilst Mary stayed sitting in the house. And Martha's words to Jesus are an expression of her faith. She believes that if Jesus had been there when Lazarus was still alive, he would not have died. She says there in verse 21, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Her words express her regret, perhaps, that Jesus had not been there in order to prevent death from occurring. Mary says the same thing in verse 32 when she comes out to meet Jesus as well. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So perhaps this was something that they had been talking about together and discussing, that, well, if only Jesus had been here, then he would not have died. Martha's next words here are puzzling. She goes on to say, "And even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give." What does she mean by this? Was she expecting Jesus to raise Lazarus from the dead? Her words in verse 24 and in verse 39 would seem to contradict that seem to indicate that she did not expect Lazarus to be raised back to life, at least not immediately. In verse 24, she says, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." And in verse 39, when Jesus instructs the stone to be taken away from the tomb entrance, she says, "Oh Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead for 4 days." So it seems from her words there that she's not really expecting a resurrection to occur at that moment. Her words may be more perhaps of a general expression of her faith that God will give Jesus whatever he asks, but perhaps her faith doesn't extend quite as far as expecting Lazarus to be raised back from the dead straight away. But Jesus then speaks directly of Lazarus's resurrection in order to reassure her. He says to her in verse 23, "Your brother will rise again." But Jesus says nothing about when that will take place, and Martha takes his words to refer to the resurrection at the last day, when she believes that her brother will rise again. And that was a common belief amongst the Pharisees and many of the Jews as well. They had a belief in the resurrection and life after death. And Jesus himself had spoken of a resurrection that was to occur in the last day, or at the last day. In chapter 5, verses 28 and 29, he said there, "Do not marvel at this, for the hour is coming when all who are in the tombs will hear his voice and come forth. Those who've done good to the resurrection of life, and those who've done evil to the resurrection of judgment." So he speaks there of a general resurrection of all in a time that is to come. And then in chapter 6 and verse 40, he says there, "For this is the will of my Father, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him should have eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." And he repeats that in verse 44, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him, and I will raise him up at the last day." And in verse 54, "He who eats my flesh and drinks my blood has eternal life, and I will raise him up at the last day." There was that belief in that resurrection that was to occur at the last day. And that's what Martha is thinking here when Jesus says that your brother will rise. She said, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. That's about as far as her hope extends at this point. But Martha's words then open the way for Jesus to make one of the greatest statements in this gospel, and it's the fifth of his "I am" statements. Just as there are 7 signs in the Gospel of John, so there are 7 "I am" statements that Jesus makes, and this is the 5th. "I am the resurrection and the life," he says. So the resurrection and life are part of the very nature of Jesus. He doesn't say there will be a resurrection, there will be life. He says, "I am the resurrection and the life." And his statement is explained in the following words. He says, "He who believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And whoever lives and believes in me shall never die." Jesus is speaking there of 2 types of people. There's the dead believer and the living believer. And since Jesus is the resurrection, then he can make alive the believer who dies. And since he is the life, then the living believer will never die. So the believer who dies physically, will live, and the living believer will never die spiritually. So you have to think through whether Jesus is referring to physical death or spiritual death and how that applies here. So the physical death of the one who believes in Jesus will not deprive that person of the eternal life, the spiritual life that Jesus provides. So we may die physically, and yet we still have life, spiritual life. And if we have that life, that spiritual life that Jesus is, then we shall never die spiritually. So the statement is really an expression of Jesus' power over life and death. And Jesus concludes making that statement by asking Martha the challenging question, "Do you believe this?" And she is called upon here to believe what Jesus is saying, that he is the resurrection and life, before Jesus has even raised Lazarus, or before he's even spoken of raising Lazarus. So she's being asked, "Do you believe this?" And her response is, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, he who is coming into the world." And this is a wonderful expression of her faith which is centered in Jesus. She affirms her belief in the things that Jesus has just said. She confesses her belief that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the Son of God, that he is the one coming into the world, the one that they have been waiting for. So Martha's words here, her confession, show her comprehension of who Jesus is. She addresses him as Lord. She says she believes that he is the Christ. She believes he is the Son of God. She believes he is the one who has come into the world. So it's a great expression of her belief at this time, a belief, a faith which will be confirmed when Jesus goes on to raise Lazarus from the dead. And her words are really reflect the whole purpose for which this gospel was written. In John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, John states the purpose that he has in recording these things, in recording these signs. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. And Martha here displays that faith through that wonderful confession that she makes here. Well, we'll stop the story here, and we'll look at part 2 of this next Wednesday evening. But there's a few things, questions we can think about from this part that we've looked at. How would the illness of Lazarus serve to glorify the Son of God? As Jesus had said that it would glorify God and glorify the Son of God. Why does Jesus speak of death as sleep? And how would you assess Martha's faith in Jesus? And what does Jesus claim to be the resurrection and the life mean to you? So if you have any